Hello, my name is Bennett and I'm coming to you today from the Maitland offices of Garfinkel Schwartz. That's a suburb of Orlando in Central Florida. I'm not a physician, nor am I an attorney, but here at Garfinkel Schwartz, I'm the medical and legal researcher, and I'm also legal assistant to attorney Brian Wickland. I'm here today to talk to you about an injury that multiple private military contractors and veterans are unfortunately all too familiar with. Bill Pascrell, a New Jersey congressman, stated that traumatic brain injury is the signature injury of the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. And here I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the physiology, the anatomy, the diagnosis, and the treatment of traumatic brain injury. And that's why I have here my model skull. So inside the skull is the human brain, and it's a fairly large object. I studied neurobiology, and I have a psychology degree from Rollins College. I ran a neurobiology lab for 2 years at Rollins College, so I have a little bit of undergraduate training in this. I also have an emergency medical technician's license, and I spent some time with Doctors Without Borders volunteering as an acute trauma medic, and in those experiences I saw a lot of traumatic brain injuries myself. So while I'm not a physician, I would like to be able to talk to you a little bit about traumatic brain injury. So if you would look at the inside of the skull, you'll see that it's not a very smooth place. There's lots of very sharp corners, and it's made out of bone. It's quite hard, and the brain, however, is almost the consistency of jelly. People don't really think of the brain as jelly, but the brain is mostly water, like all humans. And when the skull suffers a traumatic hit, what happens is the brain bounces back and forth in the skull, and that can cause bruising in the brain. And bruising in the brain is a severe and traumatic injury, and that's why it's called a traumatic injury, traumatic brain injury. If you've had a concussion, that's classified as a mild traumatic brain injury. So for the classification of traumatic brain injury, doctors and physicians use a couple scales. The first is the Glasgow Coma Scale, and that looks at reactivity and how aware a person is of their surroundings after their major head injury. There's also something called post-traumatic amnesia, and that is losing one's identity or not being able to form memories after the traumatic brain injury. And then there's also loss of consciousness, or LOC, and that's something very simple. That's whether or not you've lost consciousness after the attack. A mild traumatic brain injury, someone loses consciousness for less than 30 minutes. They have post-traumatic amnesia for less than 24 hours, and thus that's why it's classified as a mild traumatic brain injury, and that's a concussion. The most common symptoms of a traumatic brain injury when it actually happens, besides the loss of consciousness and besides the post-traumatic amnesia, which again is the loss of being able to form memories or make new memories after the head injury. The reason most of these symptoms are most common are for two reasons. If you'll again look at the skull, you'll see that the brain hits the skull on areas known as the orbitofrontal cortex, which is right here, and also the temporal lobe right here. And the most common symptoms after a head injury are vomiting, nausea, headache, being unable to form words, which is called aphasia, and those are just the immediate symptoms. But the areas that I just showed you are responsible for the lasting symptoms of traumatic brain injury, and this is why traumatic brain injury can be such a huge cause of disability and difficulty in individuals' lives. The orbitofrontal cortex here is responsible for making complex decisions, making rational, thought-out decisions and those processes. So an injury there would cause possible cognitive deficits. So maybe you don't feel as smart, or as words don't come as easily to you as they once did. And also in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is very, very important. It processes emotion, it processes memory, it processes spatial reasoning, and injuries to the temporal lobe through traumatic brain injury can cause deficits or difficulties in all of those things I just mentioned. So if one is having trouble with, say, we've had a client here that forgot where his keys were all of the time, and we mentioned that's a good idea to go to a physician and maybe get some tests to see if you have any lasting damages from a traumatic brain injury, because he did suffer a head injury in a IED, and we see a lot of traumatic brain injuries from IEDs and the blast waves that again cause the brain to bounce around in the skull. The same thing happens with falls when the skull hits a very hard object and the brain bounces back and forth in the skull. So again, that can hit the frontal lobes and also the temporal lobes. So the lasting consequences of TBI, and which is why it's a reason of disability and it's a significant injury, is one can have social deficits, one can be quick to anger. A patient with traumatic brain injury and the lasting symptoms can have difficulties with spatial reasoning, for instance, forgetting where one's keys are, and also emotion and memory problems as well. So those are very, very significant neurological injuries. And it can be difficult to diagnose whether one has a traumatic brain injury. After a patient receives a blow to the head, the most common thing will be to get a CT scan. And a CT scan is essentially an X-ray that is a 3D X-ray, and it can see the bruising in the brain. But oftentimes in Iraq or Afghanistan, a CT scan is not made available. The only report from the field medics, of which I'm very familiar with reports of field medics because I was one, will note loss of consciousness, will note if the patient is suffering from any post-traumatic amnesia, we'll see if the pupillary response is any different or unusual. Those are all signs of a traumatic brain injury. Once a private military contractor or a veteran comes back to the States, they can receive better diagnosis and treatment for traumatic brain injury. And this will include going to either a neurologist or a neuropsychologist. And people know neurologists as brain doctors, and brain doctors will look at all of those symptoms that I was talking about. They'll perform specific tests that are related to which area of the brain is responsible for, say, emotional reasoning or spatial reasoning or different types of judgment or memory problems, and they'll assign specific tests to do that. And someone called a neuropsychologist who has a PhD in neuropsychology, they'll be able to assign those same tests as well, and those tests may involve 15-minute standardized multiple test questionnaires or a test that looks at memory. And oftentimes, insurance companies will deny testing to private military contractors or DoD subcontractors that have suffered a head injury, but the insurance company will deny the individual from getting the testing to see if they actually have a traumatic brain injury. And because of its lasting effects and because of its lasting disability, insurance companies often want to deny that. But here at Garfinkel Schwartz, we feel it's very important to get the best medical care. Personally, I've gone through 5 spinal surgeries. I've been lucky enough not to get a traumatic brain injury, but I have seen lots of neurologists and been to all those tests, and it can be a grueling process. But that's one of the reasons that I feel very empathetic towards a lot of our clients because I've gone through difficult times, and I feel, and here at Garfinkel Schwartz, we feel that it's your job to get better. It's your job to get the proper medical care. It's your job to get the proper diagnosis. And so what we'll do is we'll actually forward the costs of your exam with the neurologist or the neuropsychologist to have you properly diagnosed with traumatic brain injury if you suffered a head injury over in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever you're serving U.S. interests. And for that reason, it's a good idea to give us a call to discuss your case. Again, everything you say when you call us is confidential. You'll speak with either me, or lead attorney Brian Wicklant about the merits of your case, about the legal aspects and the intricacies of the law. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me talk about the brain, and I hope if you have suffered a traumatic brain injury or a head injury of any kind, and you're a contractor working under a Department of Defense contract, you're covered under the Defense Space Act. And here at Garfinkel Schwartz, that's what we work only in Defense Space Act in areas of federal litigation that are similar. So we're a small family-oriented firm, and I'd just like to say thank you for watching this video, and hopefully we can get you some help. So again, my name is Bennett Garfinkel. I'm not a physician, I'm not an attorney. I have undergraduate training in psychology and neuroscience. And I also was a field medic with Doctors Without Borders and saw, unfortunately, some of these injuries. And I'm coming to you from the Maitland offices here at Garfinkel Schwartz, and thank you again for watching this video.